A Debt of the Kingdom. Paris, 1919. Elizabeth Garrison was boarding a train when she spotted him through the crowd. Major Nathaniel Blackwood. But that was impossible. He had been killed in action. She pushed forward, calling his name. He turned, met her gaze, and then vanished into the sea of people. Chapter 1. The Ghost at Gare du Nord. The air hung thick with coal smoke and the lingering scent of rain-soaked wool, a familiar Parisian aroma that Elizabeth Garrison usually found comforting. Today, however, it felt suffocating. Gare du Nord, normally a chaotic ballet of reunions and departures, felt more like a cage, each whistle blast of a departing train a mocking reminder of her own stalled life. It was 1919, the war officially over, yet the echoes of artillery fire still resonated in her dreams, and the ghosts of the men she tried, and often failed, to save as a nurse in Amiens still haunted her waking hours. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather satchel, its weight a small comfort against the hollowness in her chest. Inside were the few belongings she deemed necessary for her journey back to England. A worn copy of Persuasion, a silver locket containing a faded photograph of her parents, and a small, velvet-lined box holding a single, tarnished military medal de Croix de Guerre, awarded posthumously to Major Nathaniel Blackwood. Her Nathaniel. Elizabeth had spent the last year in Paris, ostensibly helping with the repatriation efforts, but in truth, she was running. Running from the memories, from the grief, from the suffocating pity in the eyes of her family back in Kent. She told herself that returning to England was a sign of strength, a step towards healing, but as she stood on the platform, jostled by weary soldiers and anxious families, she felt nothing but a bone-deep weariness. She scanned the crowd, her gaze flitting over the sea of faces, some etched with relief, others with the same haunted emptiness she felt in her own soul. The war had marked them all, leaving invisible scars that no amount of time could erase. And then she saw him. It was a fleeting glimpse, a profile half hidden by a raised collar and the brim of a fedora. But the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head, the distinctive dark wave of hair that escaped his hat, it was unmistakable. Major Nathaniel Blackwood. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was impossible. She'd seen the telegram herself, the stark, official words that had shattered her world. Killed in action. Regret to inform she'd held his lifeless hand, cold and still, in the makeshift hospital tent, the air thick with a stench of blood and disinfectant. She'd personally closed his eyes, those intense blue eyes that had once held so much life, so much promise. Nathaniel? The name escaped her lips, a desperate whisper lost in the din of the station. He turned. Just for a moment, their eyes met. It was him. No doubt. The same lean face, the same sharp jawline, the same haunting sadness in his gaze, now amplified, etched deeper by the horrors he'd surely witnessed. But there was something else there too, a flicker of recognition? Or was it fear? Before she could speak, before she could even take a step towards him, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd, disappearing as quickly and inexplicably as he'd appeared. Elizabeth pushed her way through the throng of people, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Nathaniel! Wait! She called out, her voice cracking with a mixture of hope and disbelief. People stared, their faces a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. A burly soldier bumped into her, muttering an apology in rapid-fire French. She reached the spot where he'd been standing, her hand outstretched, as if she could somehow grasp the phantom she'd just seen. There was nothing, just the swirling mass of travelers, the echoing announcements, the pervasive smell of coal smoke and despair. Had she imagined it? Was it simply the grief, playing tricks on her weary mind? She'd had vivid dreams of him before, dreams so real she'd wake up with tears streaming down her face, her hand reaching for a ghost. But this had been different. This had been real. She sank onto a nearby bench, her legs suddenly weak. Her hand trembled as she reached into her satchel, pulling out the velvet-lined box. She opened it, her fingers tracing the outline of the Croix de Guerre. The metal was cold against her skin. She remembered the day he'd been awarded it, his face flushed with pride and a hint of embarrassment. He joked that it was far too grand an honor for simply doing his duty. Duty. It was a word that had defined both their lives, a word that had brought them together and, ultimately, torn them apart. He, a career soldier, bound by oath and obligation. She, a volunteer nurse, driven by a desperate need to make a difference, to somehow atone for the comfortable, sheltered life she'd led before the war. Their romance had been brief, intense, and utterly forbidden. A stolen kiss in a moonlit garden, a whispered promise in the shadow of a bombed-out church, a handful of hastily scribbled letters exchanged across the battlefield. It was a love born of desperation and fueled by the ever-present threat of loss. A love that had burned brightly and then, seemingly, been extinguished in an instant. But now Elizabeth closed the box, the click of the latch echoing in the cavernous station. She stood up, her resolve hardening. She wasn't imagining things. She had seen him, and she would find him. She owed it to him. She owed it to herself. The war might be over, but her own personal battle had just begun. The lingering question now, a seed of doubt planted firmly in her mind, was why? Why, after being declared dead, was Nathaniel Blackwood alive, and why did he disappear the moment he saw her? The mystery felt as vast and complicated as the war itself. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Missing Major. The train rattled through the French countryside, a rhythmic clatter that usually soothed Elizabeth, but today it only amplified her anxiety. Fields of poppies, a stark reminder of the battles fought and lives lost, blurred past the window, their vibrant red a painful contrast to the grayness she felt inside. She hadn't boarded the train to England. Instead, propelled by a desperate need for answers, she'd changed her ticket. Her destination now Amiens, the town where she and Nathaniel had met, the place where he'd supposedly died. She clutched the small, worn address book in her lap, her fingers tracing the embossed initials on the cover. It contained the names and addresses of fellow nurses, doctors, and soldiers she'd served with during the war. People who might have known Nathaniel, people who might have information about his supposed death. Her first stop would be Madame Dubois, a formidable woman with a sharp tongue and a surprisingly kind heart, who'd run the auxiliary hospital where Elizabeth had worked. Madame Dubois had a network of contacts that spanned the entire region, from the highest-ranking officers to the lowliest stretcher-bearers. If anyone knew anything about Nathaniel's fate, it would be her. The journey was long and arduous, filled with delays and transfers. Elizabeth spent the hours replaying the scene at Gare du Nord in her mind, dissecting every detail, searching for clues. His eyes, they had held a flicker of recognition, hadn't they? But also fear. Why fear? Was he in danger? Was he hiding something? The questions swirled in her head, a relentless torment. She tried to distract herself by reading, but the words of Jane Austen seemed frivolous and distant in the face of her current predicament. She tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with fragmented images of Nathaniel, his face alternately smiling and sorrowful, his voice whispering her name just out of reach. As the train finally pulled into Amiens station, a wave of nostalgia washed over her. The town was scarred, bearing the visible marks of war-shattered buildings, pockmarked streets, a palpable sense of loss hanging in the air. But it was also familiar, a place where she'd found purpose and, however briefly, love. She made her way to Madame Dubois's house, a modest but well-kept dwelling on the outskirts of town. The scent of lavender and freshly baked bread wafted from the open window, a comforting aroma that momentarily eased her tension. Madame Dubois greeted her with a mixture of surprise and warmth, her sharp eyes scrutinizing Elizabeth's face. "Elizabeth, what a surprise. I thought you were heading back to England." "I was," Elizabeth replied, her voice hoarse. "But something happened. I saw someone. Someone I thought was dead." Madame Dubois's eyebrows rose. "Dead? Who?" Elizabeth hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Major Nathaniel Blackwood." The older woman's expression changed, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "Nathaniel Blackwood? But he was killed. We all received the notice." I know, Elizabeth said. But I saw him, Madame Du Bois.
At Gare du Nord.
He recognized me, I think. And then he disappeared. Madame Du Bois led her inside, to a small, cozy parlor filled with antique furniture and the lingering scent of beeswax polish. They sat down, and Elizabeth recounted the entire story, her voice trembling with emotion. Madame Du Bois listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When Elizabeth finished, she was silent for a long moment. This is most unusual, she finally said. I can't imagine why Nathaniel would fake his own death. He was a man of honor, of duty. That's what I thought, Elizabeth said. But something's not right. There was fear in his eyes. Madame Du Bois. He looked haunted. War changes men, Elizabeth. Madame Du Bois said softly. It leaves scars that we can't see. But this is different, Elizabeth insisted. I know it is. I need to find him, Madame Du Bois. I need to understand what happened. The older woman nodded slowly. I will help you, Elizabeth. I have contacts people who might know something. But you must be careful. If Nathaniel is hiding, there must be a reason. And that reason might be dangerous. A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. She hadn't considered the possibility that Nathaniel might be in danger. But the thought only strengthened her resolve. She wouldn't rest until she found him, until she uncovered the truth, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. The whispers of the missing major were about to become a roar, and Elizabeth found herself at the very center of the storm. The quiet life she craved seemed further away than ever. Chapter 3. A relic from the trenches. Madame Du Bois, true to her word, began making inquiries immediately. She sent messages through her network, discreetly asking about Major Nathaniel Blackwood, careful not to arouse suspicion. The response was slow, frustratingly so. Days turned into a week, and Elizabeth's anxiety grew with each passing hour. She spent her time revisiting familiar places, walking the streets she and Nathaniel had walked, haunted by memories of their brief, stolen moments together. She visited the makeshift hospital, now largely deserted, the rows of empty cots a stark reminder of the suffering she'd witnessed. She stood in the small garden where they'd shared their first kiss, the scent of roses still lingering in the air, a bittersweet reminder of a love that had blossomed amidst the devastation. One evening, Madame Du Bois returned with news. I've heard something, she said, her voice low. A soldier, a former member of Nathaniel's regiment, is staying at a small inn on the outskirts of town. He was wounded at the same battle where Nathaniel supposedly died. He might know something. Hope surged through Elizabeth, a fragile butterfly fluttering in her chest. Can you take me to him? She asked. Madame Du Bois nodded. But we must be careful. This soldier, his name is Sergeant Thomas Baker, is not well. The war has left its mark on him, both physically and mentally. They set out at dusk, the sky a canvas of bruised purple and fading orange. The inn was a dimly lit, ramshackle building, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and pipe smoke. Sergeant Baker was sitting alone in a corner booth, his face hidden in shadow. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, but his eyes held the weary, haunted look of someone far older. Madame Du Bois introduced Elizabeth, explaining that she was a friend of Major Blackwood. Sergeant Baker stared at her, his eyes unfocused. The Major, he's dead, he mumbled, his voice slurred. I know that's what everyone believes, Elizabeth said gently. But I saw him, Sergeant, in Paris. He's alive. The young soldier shook his head, his hands trembling. No, he's dead. I saw him fall. Elizabeth leaned closer, her voice earnest. Please, Sergeant Baker. Anything you can remember, anything at all, it could help me find him. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between Elizabeth and Madame Du Bois. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, mud-stained object. He placed it on the table, his hand shaking so violently that it clattered against the wood. It was a pocket watch, its glass face cracked, its hands frozen at the time of 2:17. But it wasn't the watch itself that caught Elizabeth's attention. It was the inscription on the back, to my dearest Nathaniel, with all my love, Elizabeth. Always. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the watch she'd given him, a gift for his birthday, just weeks before he'd been deployed to the front. She remembered the way he'd smiled, the way his eyes had sparkled with genuine affection. Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "He gave it to me," Sergeant Baker mumbled. Before the attack. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to his wife." Elizabeth stared at him, her mind reeling. His wife. Nathaniel had never mentioned a wife. He'd told her he was unmarried, unattached. Was it another lie? Or was there something more to the story? He said he wanted her to have it, Sergeant Baker continued, his voice barely audible. He said it was the only thing that mattered. Elizabeth's heart ached. The watch, a symbol of their love, now felt like a cruel reminder of the secrets he'd kept from her. But it was also proof that he had been alive, at least until that fateful day. And proof that he had thought of her, even in his final moments. "Sergeant Baker," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "Did you see what happened to him after he fell? Did you see his body?" The young soldier shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "No, there was so much smoke, so much fire, I couldn't see anything. I just ran." Elizabeth thanked him, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't trust everything Sergeant Baker said. His memories were clearly fragmented, distorted by trauma. But the watch was real. And it was a link to Nathaniel, a clue that might lead her closer to the truth. As she and Madame Dubois left the inn, the night air felt colder, the shadows deeper. The relic from the trenches had opened up more questions than it answered. The image of Nathaniel, already a ghost in her mind, was now further complicated by the revelation of a possible wife. The path ahead was becoming increasingly treacherous, yet her determination remained. She had to find the truth, even if it shattered the beautiful illusion she had carried for so long. Chapter 4. The Nurse's Confession. The revelation of the pocket watch and Sergeant Baker's mention of a wife sent Elizabeth spiraling. She returned to Madame Dubois's house in a daze, the weight of Nathaniel's potential betrayal pressing down on her. Sleep was impossible. The image of the cracked watch face, its hands frozen at the moment of his supposed death, was seared into her mind. The next morning, Madame Dubois suggested they visit another nurse who had served alongside Elizabeth in Amiens, a woman named Claire Beaumont. Claire had been closer to Nathaniel than most, often assisting him with administrative tasks and even sharing a few social occasions outside of the hospital. Claire was always discreet, Madame Dubois said, as they walked through the bustling marketplace, the air filled with the scent of fresh produce and the chatter of vendors. But she might have known something about Nathaniel's personal life. She was observant. They found Claire working at a small clinic, tending to a group of children with minor injuries. She greeted Elizabeth with a warm smile, but her eyes held a hint of sadness, a reflection of the shared trauma they'd all endured. After exchanging pleasantries, Elizabeth steered the conversation towards Nathaniel. "Claire, do you remember Major Blackwood well?" Claire nodded, her gaze softening. "Of course. He was a good man. A brave soldier. Did you know anything about his personal life?" Elizabeth asked, her voice hesitant. "Anything about a wife?" Claire's smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise. "A wife? No, I don't recall him ever mentioning a wife." Elizabeth felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly extinguished by doubt. Sergeant Baker, a soldier from his regiment, said that Nathaniel gave him a watch to give to his wife. She described the watch, the inscription, the cracked face. Claire's eyes widened. That's the watch you gave him, isn't it? For his birthday?" Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding. Claire was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Then, she took a deep breath and looked at Elizabeth, her gaze filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked like guilt. "Elizabeth," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I've kept secret for a long time." Elizabeth's stomach clenched. She had a feeling she wasn't going to like what she was about to hear. "Nathaniel, he wasn't always honest with you," Claire continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He had a fiancée. Back in England. An arranged engagement, I believe. Something his family had insisted upon. The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. A fiancé. So, it wasn't a wife, but it was close enough. Another woman, another commitment, another lie. He never told me, Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking. Claire shook her head. He couldn't. He was bound by duty, by family obligation. But he loved you, Elizabeth. I saw it in his eyes. He was torn between his duty and his heart. Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a lingering, stubborn sadness. She'd known their love was forbidden, but she believed it was real. She believed he was real. Why are you telling me this now? Elizabeth asked, her voice choked with emotion. Claire sighed. Because I saw the way he looked at you. And because I saw the telegram. The one announcing his death. It wasn't entirely accurate. Elizabeth stared at her, her mind reeling. What do you mean? The telegram said he was killed in action, Claire said, her voice low. But that's not what I heard. I heard from a reliable source that he was injured, yes, but not fatally. He was captured. Taken prisoner by the Germans. Captured. Not dead. The words echoed in Elizabeth's mind, a faint glimmer of hope piercing through the darkness of her despair. But if he was a prisoner, why hadn't he been released? The war was over. Why hasn't he come back? Elizabeth asked, her voice desperate. Claire shook her head. I don't know. Perhaps he's still being held. Perhaps he doesn't want to come back. The last possibility stung, a sharp, agonizing pain in Elizabeth's chest. Could he have chosen to abandon her? To disappear, rather than face the consequences of his deception? The nurse's confession had unveiled a web of complexities, forcing Elizabeth to confront a devastating truth. The man she loved was not who she thought he was, and his survival might be more a curse than a blessing. The hope that had flickered was now threatened by a storm of uncertainty. Chapter 5. Shadows of Amiens. Claire's revelation that Nathaniel had been captured, not killed, sent Elizabeth on a new, frantic search. The possibility of his survival, however slim, reignited the embers of hope that had been dwindling in her heart. But the questions remained. Why hadn't he returned? Was he still a prisoner? Or, as Claire had suggested, was he choosing to stay away? She spent days scouring the records at the local military archives, poring over lists of prisoners of war, casualty reports, and repatriation documents. The task was overwhelming, the sheer volume of information daunting. But Elizabeth was relentless, driven by a desperate need to find any trace of Nathaniel, any clue that might lead her to him. Madame Dubois, ever supportive, used her connections to contact officials in the War Office, both in France and in England. The responses were slow and unhelpful, filled with bureaucratic jargon and vague assurances. It seemed that Major Nathaniel Blackwood had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the chaos of war. One evening, while walking back to Madame Dubois's house, Elizabeth noticed a figure lurking in the shadows of a nearby alleyway. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He seemed to be watching her, his gaze intense and unsettling. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. The streets of Amiens, once familiar and comforting, now felt menacing, filled with unseen dangers. She glanced back, but the man was gone. She dismissed it as paranoia, a product of her heightened anxiety. But the incident left her shaken, a nagging feeling of unease settling in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that someone was watching her every move. The next day, she received a cryptic message, delivered by a young boy who refused to say who had sent it. The message was written on a scrap of paper, in a hurried, almost illegible scrawl. Meet me at the old church. Midnight. Come alone. Elizabeth's hand trembled as she read the note. Who had sent it? And why? Was it a trap? Or was it a lead, a message from someone who knew about Nathaniel? She debated whether to go. It was risky, dangerous even, but the thought of getting closer to Nathaniel, of finally finding some answers, was too strong to resist. She told Madame Dubois about the message, expressing her concerns. The older woman was understandably worried. Elizabeth, this could be dangerous. You don't know who this person is or what they want. I know, Elizabeth said. But I have to go. I have to find out if it's about Nathaniel. Madame Du Bois sighed, her expression resigned. Then, I'm going with you. Elizabeth shook her head. No, the message said to come alone. It might scare them off if I bring someone with me. But I'll be careful, Elizabeth insisted. I promise. And if I'm not back by dawn, then you can alert the authorities. Reluctantly, Madame Du Bois agreed. She gave Elizabeth a small, silver whistle, a relic from her own days as a resistance fighter during the earlier years of the war. Blow this if you're in trouble, she said, her voice tight with worry. I'll be listening. Elizabeth tucked the whistle into her pocket, her hand shaking. The shadows of Amiens were deepening, both literally and figuratively. The meeting at the old church felt like a descent into the unknown, a gamble with potentially devastating consequences. But she was prepared to risk everything to find Nathaniel, even if it meant facing danger alone. The question now was whether this mysterious summons would provide answers, or simply lead her deeper into the labyrinth of secrets surrounding his disappearance. Chapter 6. The Spy's Rendezvous. The old church stood on a hill overlooking Amiens, a silent sentinel scarred by war. Its windows were shattered, its roof partially collapsed, and its stone walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. It was a place of ghosts, a reminder of the devastation that had swept through the town. A fitting location, Elizabeth thought, for a meeting shrouded in secrecy. She arrived just before midnight, the moon casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown churchyard. The air was cold and damp, a chill wind whispering through the broken windows. She clutched the silver whistle Madame Du Bois had given her, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She entered the church cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The only light came from the moon, filtering through the shattered stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the dusty floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She waited, her senses on high alert. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of the wind, sent shivers down her spine. She was about to turn and leave, convinced that the message had been a cruel hoax, when she heard a voice. "You came." The voice was low, husky, and unfamiliar. Elizabeth turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a man silhouetted against the moonlight. He was tall and slender, his face obscured by the darkness. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice regaining some of its strength. "And why did you want to meet me?" The man stepped closer, and the moonlight illuminated his features. He was older than she'd expected, his face lined and weathered, with a network of fine wrinkles around his eyes. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent, and they held a hint of sadness. "I know about Major Blackwood," he said, his voice still low. Elizabeth's heart leaped. "You do? Where is he? Is he alive?" The man hesitated. "He is alive. But he's in danger."
Danger?
"From whom?" "From the people he was working for," the man said. Elizabeth stared at him, confused. "Working for?
What are you talking about?"
The man sighed. "Major Blackwood wasn't just a soldier, Miss Garrison. He was an intelligence officer."
A spy. A spy.
The word hung in the air, a shocking revelation that turned Elizabeth's world upside down. Nathaniel, a spy? It seemed impossible. And yet, it explained so much. The secrecy, the evasiveness, the sudden disappearance. I don't understand," Elizabeth stammered. "He was working undercover," the man continued, "gathering information on German troop movements, supply lines, that sort of thing. He was very good at it. Too good, perhaps." "What do you mean?" "He uncovered something big. Something that put him in grave danger. He was betrayed, Miss Garrison. By someone he trusted."
Betrayed.
The word echoed the pain she'd felt when she'd learned about his fiancée. But this was different. This was a betrayal on a much grander scale, a betrayal that had potentially cost him his life. Or at least his freedom. Who betrayed him? Elizabeth asked, her voice urgent. The man shook his head. "I don't know. That's what I need your help to find out. My help? How can I help?
You were close to him, the man said.
You knew him better than anyone. You might know something that could lead us to his betrayer.
And to him.
Elizabeth thought back to her time with Nathaniel, to their conversations, their stolen moments together. Had he given her any clues? Had he inadvertently revealed something that might help? The spy's rendezvous had cast a new light on everything she thought she knew about Nathaniel. The stakes were higher, the danger more profound, and the truth more elusive than ever. She had a choice to make: retreat into the safety of ignorance, or step into the dangerous world of espionage and fight for the man she loved. Chapter 7. Letters from a Dead Man. The spy, who identified himself only as Monsieur Dubois, a likely alias, Elizabeth suspected, and a possible relative of Madame Dubois, though he wouldn't confirm, it left her with a daunting task: to sift through her memories of Nathaniel, searching for any clue, any detail that might shed light on his secret life as an intelligence officer. He also gave her a small, locked wooden box. These were found among his belongings, Monsieur Dubois said. They were intercepted by friends. They might contain something useful. Elizabeth returned to Madame Dubois's house, her mind reeling. The revelation that Nathaniel had been a spy was both shocking and strangely exhilarating. It added another layer of complexity to the man she loved, a man who was becoming more of an enigma with each passing day. She told Madame Dubois about the meeting, omitting only the mention of Monsieur Dubois and his possible connection to her. Madame Dubois was surprised, but not entirely shocked, by the news of Nathaniel's espionage activities. It makes sense in a way, she said.
He always had a certain intensity about him.
A quiet determination. And he was always asking questions, observing things. Elizabeth spent the rest of the night examining the wooden box. It was small, but heavy, made of dark, polished wood. She found a locksmith in town the next morning who was able to open it without damaging the contents. Inside, she found a collection of letters. They were all addressed to Nathaniel, and they were all from the same person, a woman named Isabel. Elizabeth's heart sank. Isabel, another woman. Was this his fiancée? Or someone else entirely? She began to read the letters, her hands trembling. They were written in French, a language Elizabeth was fluent in, thanks to her time in Paris. The letters were passionate, intimate, filled with expressions of love and longing. But they were also strange. Isabel wrote about meetings in hidden locations, about coded messages, about dangerous assignments. She referred to Nathaniel as Le Faucon the Falcon. It was clear that Isabel was also involved in espionage, and that she and Nathaniel were working together. But as Elizabeth read further, she noticed a growing sense of unease in Isabel's letters. She wrote about being followed, about suspecting betrayal, about fearing for her life. And then, the letters stopped abruptly. The last letter was dated just a few days before Nathaniel's supposed death. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Had Isabel been killed? Had her fate been somehow connected to Nathaniel's disappearance? She carefully examined the letters again, searching for any clues, any names, any locations that might be significant. She noticed that Isabel often used a particular phrase, sous la lune argentée, under the silver moon. It seemed to be a code, a reference to something specific. But what? She also found a small, folded piece of paper tucked inside one of the envelopes. It was a map, a hand-drawn sketch of a section of the French countryside, with a single building marked with an X. The location was unfamiliar to Elizabeth, but she recognized the general area. It was near the Somme, the site of some of the fiercest fighting of the war. The letters from a dead man had opened up a new avenue of investigation, a dangerous path into the heart of a conspiracy. Isabel, Le Faucon, sous la lune argentée, and the map, these were the pieces of a puzzle that Elizabeth had to solve, a puzzle that held the key to Nathaniel's fate and, possibly, to his survival. The weight of the secrets, and the danger surrounding them, pressed down on her, but she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 8. Beneath the Parisian Moon. The phrase sous la lune argentée, under the silver moon, echoed in Elizabeth's mind, a cryptic clue that she felt held the key to unlocking the mystery surrounding Nathaniel and Isabel. She shared the letters and the map with Madame Du Bois, who, despite her initial reservations, was becoming increasingly drawn into the intrigue. "It's a code, clearly," Madame Du Bois said, examining the letters with a magnifying glass. "But what does it mean? A place? A time? A person?" Elizabeth had been pondering the same question. She remembered Nathaniel mentioning a favorite cafe in Paris, a small, secluded place called Le Chat Noir, the Black Cat. He'd said it was a popular meeting spot for artists and writers, a place where secrets were whispered and deals were made. Could that be it? I think it might be a place," Elizabeth said. "A cafe in Paris." Nathaniel mentioned it once. He said it was called Le Chat Noir. Madame Du Bois's eyes widened.
Le Chat Noir?
That's a known haunt for spies and informants. It's been used for that purpose for decades. A surge of excitement coursed through Elizabeth. It made sense. A cafe, a place where people could meet discreetly, exchange information, and disappear into the crowd. And the name the Black Cat, a symbol of secrecy and mystery. They decided to travel to Paris, to visit Le Chat Noir, and see if they could find any trace of Isabel, any clue that might lead them to Nathaniel. They knew it was a long shot, but it was the best lead they had. The journey to Paris was tense, filled with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was following their every move. She kept glancing out the train window, scanning the faces of her fellow passengers, searching for any sign of danger. They arrived in Paris under the cover of darkness, the city bathed in the soft glow of gaslight. The streets were bustling, filled with a mix of revelers and weary workers. The war might be over, but the city still bore the scars of conflict, both visible and invisible. Le Chat Noir was located in Montmartre, a bohemian district known for its artists, writers, and spies. The cafe was small and dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of tobacco smoke and strong coffee. The walls were adorned with paintings and posters, and the tables were crowded with people engaged in hushed conversations. Elizabeth and Madame Du Bois found a table in a secluded corner, their eyes scanning the room. They ordered coffee, trying to blend in with the other patrons. They waited, watching, listening, hoping for some sign, some clue. After an hour, Elizabeth was about to give up hope when she noticed a woman sitting alone at a nearby table. She was young, with dark hair and striking green eyes. She was dressed simply, but there was an air of elegance about her, a quiet confidence that set her apart. And she was wearing a silver pendant, shaped like a crescent moon. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat.
Sous la lune argentée.
Could this be Isabel? Or someone connected to her? She nudged Madame Du Bois, her voice barely a whisper. "Look, the woman at the next table. The silver moon pendant." Madame Du Bois followed her gaze, her eyes widening in recognition. It's the same symbol as on the letters," she whispered. Elizabeth took a deep breath and stood up. She walked over to the woman's table, her heart pounding. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't help but notice your pendant. It's beautiful." The woman looked up, her green eyes studying Elizabeth with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "I'm looking for someone," Elizabeth continued. "Someone who used the phrase, sous la lune argentée." The woman's expression changed, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She hesitated, then glanced around the cafe, as if checking to see if they were being overheard.
Who are you?
She asked, her voice low. "And why are you looking for that person?" Elizabeth decided to take a risk, to reveal her connection to Nathaniel. "My name is Elizabeth Garrison," she said. "I was a friend of Major Nathaniel Blackwood. I believe he was working with someone named Isabel. Someone who used that phrase." The woman stared at her, her green eyes searching Elizabeth's face. Then, after what seemed an eternity to Elizabeth, and taking one more look around the dimly lit interior, she gave a single nod. The meeting beneath the Parisian moon had finally yielded a breakthrough, but whether it was a step closer to Nathaniel or a descent into deeper danger remained to be seen. Chapter 9. The Scarred Portrait. The woman with the silver crescent moon pendant identified herself as Genevieve, a close friend and colleague of Isabel. She confirmed that Isabel and Nathaniel Lofaken, as she knew him, had been working together as intelligence officers, gathering information on German operations in France. Genevieve was initially wary of Elizabeth, suspicious of her motives. But Elizabeth's genuine concern for Nathaniel and her knowledge of the letters and the map eventually convinced Genevieve that she was trustworthy. At Genevieve's invitation, to ensure more privacy, they left the smoky interior of Le Chat Noir, with Madame Dubois choosing to remain behind, just in case. They walked through the dimly lit streets of Montmartre, finally stopping at Genevieve's modest apartment. The space was small but tidy. One item, prominently displayed, instantly grabbed Elizabeth's attention. On a small table stood a framed portrait. It was a charcoal sketch of Nathaniel, but it was unlike any image of him she had ever seen. This Nathaniel was older, his face bearing a network of fine scars, one running prominently across his left cheek. His eyes, though still recognizable as the intense blue she remembered, held a depth of weariness and pain that made her heart ache. "That's him?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Genevieve nodded. "It was drawn a few months ago by a mutual acquaintance. After his escape." Escape. The word sent a shiver of hope through Elizabeth. So, he had escaped from captivity. But where was he now? And why hadn't he contacted her? "Isabel, what happened to her?" Elizabeth asked, her voice hesitant. Genevieve's expression clouded over. "She was captured. Shortly after she sent that last letter to Nathaniel. We believe she was betrayed. By the same person who betrayed Nathaniel. Do you know who it was?" Genevieve shook her head.
No.
"But we have our suspicions. There was a high-ranking officer in British intelligence, a man named Sir Alistair Finch. He was Nathaniel's superior, his handler. He was also jealous of Nathaniel's success and his relationship with Isabel." Sir Alistair Finch. The name was unfamiliar to Elizabeth, but the implication was clear. A man in a position of power, a man who could have manipulated events, betrayed his own agents, and covered his tracks. Why would he betray them? Elizabeth asked.
Power.
Greed. Jealousy, Genevieve said. Finch was ambitious, ruthless. He wanted to control the intelligence network, to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. And he wanted Isabel for himself. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, forming a disturbing picture of betrayal and deception. Nathaniel hadn't simply disappeared, he'd been forced into hiding, betrayed by a man he'd trusted, a man who was still out there, still a threat. "Where is Nathaniel now?" Elizabeth asked, her voice urgent. Genevieve hesitated. "I don't know for sure. He's in hiding. He's been moving around, trying to stay one step ahead of Finch. But I know he's planning something. He's determined to expose Finch, to clear his name, and to avenge Isabel. Can you help me find him?" Elizabeth pleaded. Genevieve looked at her, her green eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. "It's dangerous, Elizabeth. Finch is a powerful man. He has eyes and ears everywhere." "I don't care," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "I need to see him. I need to help him." Genevieve studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There's a place, a safe house. Near the Somme. The location marked on the map you found. It's where Nathaniel was planning to meet Isabel before she was captured. He might be there. Or he might be heading there."
The Somme.
The very place where he'd supposedly died. It was a fitting location, a place of ghosts and memories, a place where the past and the present collided. "I need to go there," Elizabeth said, her resolve hardening. "I need to find him." The scarred portrait served as a stark reminder of the dangers Nathaniel had faced and the toll it had taken on him. It also strengthened Elizabeth's determination. She was no longer simply searching for a lost lover, she was fighting for a man who had been betrayed, a man who deserved justice, and a man who, despite everything, still held a place in her heart. Chapter 10. A Dance of Deception. Genevieve provided Elizabeth with detailed instructions on how to reach the safe house near the Somme, a remote farmhouse that had been used by the resistance during the war. She warned Elizabeth to be careful, to trust no one, and to avoid drawing attention to herself. Finch's network was extensive, and she could be under surveillance without even realizing it. Before leaving Paris, Elizabeth decided to pay a visit to the British Embassy. She had a contact there, a minor official named Mr. Henderson, who had helped her with some paperwork related to her nursing service. She hoped he might have some information about Sir Alistair Finch, however limited. She arranged a meeting with Mr. Henderson, presenting herself as a concerned friend of Major Blackwood, inquiring about his status and any possible efforts to locate him. Mr. Henderson was polite but unhelpful, claiming to have no knowledge of Major Blackwood's current situation. He reiterated the official line that the Major was presumed dead, killed in action. But Elizabeth noticed something in his eyes, a flicker of unease, a hint of deception. He seemed to be avoiding her gaze, his answers evasive and carefully worded. She suspected he knew more than he was letting on, but she couldn't prove it. As she was leaving the embassy, she noticed a man watching her from across the street. He was tall and well-dressed, with a stern, imposing demeanor. He had a familiar look about him, a resemblance to someone she'd seen before. Then, she realized, he looked like Sir Alistair Finch, the man Genevieve had described as Nathaniel's betrayer. Her heart pounded. Was it him? Or was it just her imagination, fueled by paranoia and fear? She quickly hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address of a random department store, a place far from her actual destination. She needed to shake off any potential followers to make sure she wasn't being tracked. As the taxi sped away, she glanced back. The man was still there, standing on the corner, watching her. He made no attempt to follow her, but his presence was unsettling, a clear indication that she was stepping into dangerous territory. She spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alert, constantly looking over her shoulder, changing her plans, and avoiding any direct route to her destination. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, a dance of deception with a powerful and ruthless adversary. That evening, she met with Madame Dubois, who had decided to accompany her to the Somme. They reviewed Genevieve's instructions, memorizing the route, the landmarks, and the code words they would need to use to identify themselves to anyone at the safe house. "Are you sure about this, Elizabeth?" Madame Dubois asked, her voice filled with concern. "This is becoming increasingly dangerous. We're dealing with powerful people who won't hesitate to eliminate any threat." Elizabeth nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I have to do this, Madame Dubois. For Nathaniel. And for myself." They set out before dawn the next morning, traveling by train and then by a series of local buses, avoiding the main roads and sticking to the back roads. The journey was long and arduous, the landscape a stark reminder of the devastation of war. They passed through ruined villages, fields scarred by trenches and shell craters, and forests filled with the ghosts of fallen soldiers. The dance of deception had begun, and Elizabeth was fully immersed in its intricate steps. The encounter at the embassy, the potential sighting of Finch, and the constant fear of surveillance had heightened the stakes. She was no longer just searching for Nathaniel, she was actively evading a powerful enemy, an enemy who might be closer than she realized. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. The journey to the Somme was fraught with tension. Every stranger's glance, every unexpected delay, felt like a potential threat. Elizabeth and Madame Dubois communicated in hushed tones, using coded language whenever possible, constantly aware that they might be overheard or followed. They finally reached the outskirts of the village nearest the safe house late in the afternoon. The landscape was bleak, a desolate expanse of rolling hills and skeletal trees, still bearing the scars of the brutal battles that had raged there years before. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and a lingering, almost metallic, tang of decay. Following Genevieve's instructions, they found a small, unmarked path leading away from the main road. They followed it cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The path wound through a dense wood, eventually opening onto a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood the farmhouse, a 2-story stone building with a slate roof and shuttered windows. It looked deserted, abandoned. Elizabeth approached the farmhouse cautiously, her hand resting on the silver whistle in her pocket. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, using the coded sequence Genevieve had given her. 3 short knocks, a pause, then 2 longer knocks. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time. Still no response. She tried the door handle. It was unlocked. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding. The interior of the farmhouse was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of mildew and disuse. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the rooms a ghostly appearance. "Hello?" Elizabeth called out, her voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. She and Madame Dubois exchanged a worried glance. Had they been misled? Was the safe house no longer safe? Or had Nathaniel already been there and gone? They began to search the house, carefully examining each room, looking for any sign of recent occupation, any clue that might indicate Nathaniel's presence. They found nothing. As they were about to give up, Madame Dubois noticed something on the floor in one of the upstairs bedrooms. It was a small, blood-stained scrap of cloth. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. "Elizabeth, look at this," she said, her voice hushed. Elizabeth took the cloth, her heart sinking. It was a piece of a military uniform, a British uniform, and the blood, it was fresh. A wave of fear washed over her. Had Nathaniel been here? Had he been injured? Or worse? Suddenly, they heard a noise outside, the sound of footsteps approaching the house. They quickly extinguished the lamp they were carrying, plunging the room into darkness. They crouched down behind a bed, their hearts pounding. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and a figure entered, silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Elizabeth held her breath, her finger tightening around the silver whistle. She was about to blow it, to signal for help, when the figure spoke. "Elizabeth?" The voice was familiar, a voice she thought she'd never hear again. It was Nathaniel, but his appearance, it was shocking. He was thinner, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. And the scars the portrait had not exaggerated. A network of fine lines crisscrossed his face, a permanent reminder of the trauma he'd endured. "Nathaniel," Elizabeth whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He lowered the pistol, his gaze softening as he recognized her. He rushed forward, dropping the lantern and taking her in his arms. He held her tight, his body trembling. "You're alive," she said, tears streaming down her face. I thought you were dead." "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I had to disappear. It was the only way." He explained everything, his voice filled with a mixture of anger, regret, and a deep, abiding sadness. He confirmed Genevieve's story. He'd been betrayed by Sir Alistair Finch, framed for treason, and forced to flee for his life. He'd been hiding out, gathering evidence to expose Finch and clear his name. He'd been injured recently, during a confrontation with one of Finch's men. That explained the bloodstained cloth. He'd managed to escape, but he was still in danger. "Finch knows I'm alive," Nathaniel said. "He's hunting me. He won't stop until I'm silenced." The price of loyalty, Elizabeth realized, was steep. Nathaniel had risked everything to serve his country, and he'd been repaid with betrayal and persecution. And now, she was caught in the crossfire, her own life in danger simply by being with him. But she wouldn't abandon him. She would stand by him, fight with him, until they could expose Finch and bring him to justice. Chapter 12. Escape from the Chateau. The reunion with Nathaniel, though filled with relief and a surge of renewed love, was overshadowed by the immediate danger they faced. Finch's men were closing in, and the farmhouse, once a sanctuary, was now a potential death trap. "We have to leave," Nathaniel said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
"They'll be here soon." He quickly gathered his few belongings, a worn leather satchel containing his intelligence documents, the pistol, and a small, silver-framed photograph of Elizabeth taken during their brief time together in Amiens. The sight of the photograph, a tangible reminder of their love, brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. They left the farmhouse under the cover of darkness, moving swiftly and silently through the woods. Nathaniel, despite his injuries, was surprisingly agile, his movements honed by years of military training and his recent months in hiding. He led them along a hidden path, a route known only to locals and resistance fighters. Their destination, he explained, was a nearby chateau, owned by a distant relative of Madame Dubois, a woman named Countess de Valois. The Countess was a staunch supporter of the resistance, and her chateau had served as a safe haven for Allied agents during the war. "She's the only one we can trust," Nathaniel said. "She has resources, connections. She can help us get out of France." The journey to the chateau was perilous. They had to avoid the main roads, sticking to the backwoods and fields, constantly on the lookout for Finch's men. They could hear the distant sounds of vehicles, the occasional bark of a dog, reminders that they were being hunted. They reached the chateau just before dawn, exhausted and shaken. The chateau was a magnificent structure, a sprawling stone building with turrets and towers, surrounded by a vast, manicured garden. It seemed like a world away from the war-torn landscape they'd just traversed. The Countess, a woman of regal bearing and sharp intelligence, greeted them warmly, her eyes filled with concern. She'd been expecting them, having received a coded message from Madame Dubois. She ushered them inside, to a hidden room behind a large bookcase in the library. "You're safe here for now," she said, her voice reassuring. "But Finch's reach is long. We must make plans quickly." She provided them with food, fresh clothes, and medical attention for Nathaniel's injuries. Elizabeth, with her nursing experience, helped to clean and dress his wounds. As she tended to him, their hands touched, their eyes met, and a spark of their former love rekindled, a fragile flame flickering amidst the darkness of their situation. The Countess explained that she had contacts within the French government, people who could help them expose Finch and his corrupt network. But it would take time, and time was something they didn't have. "Finch will be looking for you everywhere," she said. "He'll be watching the ports, the train stations, the airports. We need to find a way to get you out of the country undetected." She proposed a daring plan, a secret escape route used by smugglers for centuries that led through the mountains to the Spanish border. It was a dangerous journey, but it was their best hope of evading Finch and reaching safety. They spent the next few days preparing for the escape, gathering supplies, studying maps, and planning their route. Nathaniel, despite his injuries, was determined to lead the way. He was driven by a fierce desire for justice, a need to clear his name and avenge Isabel's death. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth and Nathaniel shared a quiet moment together, a brief respite from the danger that surrounded them. They stood on the balcony of the chateau, overlooking the gardens, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. "I never stopped loving you, Elizabeth," Nathaniel said, his voice husky with emotion. "Even when I thought I'd lost you forever." "And I never stopped loving you," Elizabeth replied, her eyes filling with tears. "Even when I thought you were dead." They embraced, their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating as one. It was a moment of bittersweet joy, a stolen moment of peace amidst the storm. But the storm was gathering. As they prepared to depart, a detachment of soldiers arrived at the chateau, led by a tall, stern-faced man, Sir Alistair Finch. The escape from the chateau had become a desperate race against time, a fight for survival against a powerful and ruthless enemy. The sanctuary had become a trap, and their carefully laid plans were about to be tested in the crucible of fire. Chapter 13. The Wounded Soldier's Plea. The arrival of Finch and his soldiers at the chateau sent a wave of panic through the hidden room. The Countess, ever resourceful, quickly ushered Elizabeth, Nathaniel, and Madame Dubois into a secret passage behind the bookcase, a narrow, winding tunnel that led to the chateau's extensive cellars. "Hurry," she urged, her voice low and urgent. "They mustn't find you here." They descended into the darkness, the air growing cold and damp. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, forcing them to move in single file. Nathaniel, weakened by his injuries, struggled to keep up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elizabeth, walking behind him, placed a comforting hand on his back, offering him support. "We're almost there," she whispered, trying to sound braver than she felt. They reached the cellars, a vast, labyrinthine network of stone chambers and passageways. The Countess had given them instructions on how to reach a hidden exit, a small, iron door that led to the outside world. But as they navigated the dark, winding corridors, they heard voices, the sound of Finch's soldiers searching the chateau. They were getting closer. They found the iron door, but it was locked. Nathaniel tried to force it open, but his injured shoulder wouldn't allow him to exert enough strength. "Let me try," Madame Dubois said, stepping forward. She produced a set of lockpicks from her bag, tools she'd acquired during her days in the Resistance. She worked quickly and efficiently, her fingers nimble despite her age. But the lock was stubborn, resisting her efforts. The voices of the soldiers were growing louder, closer. They were running out of time. Suddenly, they heard a different voice, a weak, pleading voice coming from a nearby chamber. "Help, please help me," Elizabeth hesitated. It was a risk, a distraction from their escape. But she couldn't ignore the plea for help. "Nathaniel, stay here," she said. "I'll be right back." She followed the sound of the voice, her heart pounding. She found a small, dark chamber, its only illumination coming from a crack in the stone wall. In the corner of the chamber, lying on a pile of straw, was a young soldier, his uniform torn and blood-stained. He was barely conscious, his face pale and drawn. "What happened?" Elizabeth asked, kneeling beside him. "Ambush," the soldier whispered, his voice weak. "Finch's men, they shot me." He was losing blood rapidly. Elizabeth, drawing on her nursing experience, quickly assessed his injuries. He had a gunshot wound to the leg, a serious but potentially treatable injury. She knew she couldn't leave him. He would die without medical attention. But she also couldn't stay. Finch's men were closing in. She made a quick decision. She ripped a strip of cloth from her dress and fashioned a makeshift tourniquet, tying it tightly around the soldier's leg to stem the bleeding. "I'll get help," she promised, her voice firm.
"I'll come back for you."
She returned to Nathaniel and Madame Dubois, who were still struggling with the lock. She explained the situation, her voice urgent.
"We have to help him," she said.
"He's badly injured. He won't survive if we leave him." Nathaniel hesitated. He knew the risks, but he also knew that he couldn't abandon a fellow soldier.
"We'll take him with us," he said.
"We'll find a way." Madame Dubois finally managed to pick the lock, and the iron door swung open. They quickly helped the wounded soldier to his feet, supporting his weight between them. They emerged from the chateau into the cool night air, the moon casting long, eerie shadows across the grounds. They moved quickly and silently, avoiding the main paths and sticking to the shadows. The wounded soldier's plea had added another layer of complexity to their escape, a moral dilemma that had forced them to make a difficult choice. They were now not only fugitives, but also rescuers, their own lives intertwined with the fate of a stranger. The escape had become a test of their courage, their compassion, and their commitment to each other. Chapter 14. Betrayal at Dawn. They carried the wounded soldier, whose name they learned was Private Thomas Baker, a strange coincidence, given her encounter with the Sergeant Thomas Baker in Amiens through the dense woods surrounding the chateau, their pace slow and arduous. Nathaniel, despite his own injuries, insisted on taking the brunt of the young man's weight, his determination fueled by a sense of duty and a growing respect for Elizabeth's unwavering compassion. As dawn approached, they reached the edge of the woods, overlooking a small village nestled in a valley below. According to the Countess's instructions, there was a safe house in the village, a small bakery run by a trusted member of the Resistance. But as they approached the village, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The village was swarming with soldiers, Finch's men. They were searching houses, questioning villagers, their presence a clear indication that Finch knew they were in the area. "We can't go there," Elizabeth whispered, her voice filled with despair. "It's a trap." Nathaniel scanned the village, his eyes narrowed.
"There's another way," he said.
"A back road, leading to the mountains. It's longer, more difficult, but it might be our only chance." They changed their course, heading towards the rugged, mountainous terrain that bordered the village. The climb was steep and treacherous, the terrain uneven and rocky. Private Baker, weakened by his injuries, was struggling to keep up, his moans of pain a constant reminder of the urgency of their situation. As they climbed higher, the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the landscape. But the beauty of the dawn was overshadowed by the ever-present threat of discovery. They could hear the distant sounds of vehicles, the occasional shout of a soldier, reminders that Finch's men were still searching for them. Suddenly, they heard a voice, a familiar voice calling out from behind them. Nathaniel! Elizabeth!
Wait.
They turned to see Madame Du Bois, running towards them, her face pale and distraught. What is it? Nathaniel asked, his voice tense. It's the Countess, Madame Du Bois gasped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She's been arrested. Finch, he found her, he tortured her, she told him everything. Betrayal. The word hung in the air, a cold, chilling reality. The Countess, their trusted ally, had broken under torture and revealed their escape route, their destination, their plans. Elizabeth's heart sank. The Countess's betrayal was a devastating blow, a setback that could cost them everything. We have to keep moving, Nathaniel said, his voice grim. Finch knows where we're going. He'll be waiting for us. But as they turned to continue their climb, they saw them. A group of soldiers, led by Sir Alistair Finch himself, standing at the foot of the mountain, blocking their path. Finch smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who we have here. The elusive Major Blackwood. And his companions. They were trapped, surrounded by Finch's men, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The betrayal at dawn had sealed their fate, or so it seemed. The carefully laid plans, the courageous escape, had all come to naught. The mountains, once a symbol of hope and freedom, had become a prison. Chapter 15. The Reckoning in Reims. Cornered, with Finch and his men closing in, Nathaniel knew they were out of options. He looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. He would not let her be captured, not after all they had been through. Run, Elizabeth, he said, his voice low and urgent. Take Private Baker and get out of here. I'll hold them off. Elizabeth shook her head, tears streaming down her face.
No, Nathaniel.
I won't leave you. We're in this together. There's no time to argue, Nathaniel said, pushing her gently towards the upward slope of the mountain.
Go.
That's an order. He turned to face Finch, drawing his pistol. He knew it was a futile gesture, a desperate attempt to buy Elizabeth and Private Baker some time. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and injured. But he would fight to the end, for her, for his honor, for the justice he sought. But before Nathaniel could fire a shot, a voice rang out, a voice filled with authority and righteous anger. Stop. In the name of the king. Everyone froze, turning to see a detachment of British soldiers, led by a tall, distinguished-looking officer, marching towards them. The officer was none other than General Howard, Nathaniel's former commanding officer, a man of impeccable integrity and unwavering loyalty. Finch's smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock and disbelief. General Howard? What is the meaning of this? I'm here to arrest you, Sir Alistair, General Howard said, his voice cold and firm. For treason, conspiracy, and the attempted murder of Major Blackwood. It turned out that Madame Du Bois, after witnessing the Countess' apparent betrayal, had not given up hope. Instead of fleeing, she'd used a hidden radio transmitter in the chateau, or relic from the Countess's resistance days, unknown even to the Countess herself, to contact General Howard, providing him with irrefutable evidence of Finch's treachery, evidence Nathaniel had painstakingly gathered and entrusted to Madame Du Bois. General Howard, a man who valued loyalty above all else, had acted swiftly, mobilizing his troops and racing to intercept Finch. Finch, realizing that he was caught, tried to bluff his way out, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, a mistake. But his lies were quickly exposed. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The intercepted messages, the forged documents, the testimony of witnesses, and the very presence of Nathaniel Blackwood, alive and well, a living testament to Finch's treachery. Finch's men, realizing that they had been used and deceived, surrendered without a fight. Finch himself was arrested, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The reckoning in Reims, although it didn't occur in the city itself, had arrived. The tables had turned, not through a desperate escape, but through the courage and loyalty of unexpected allies. Nathaniel, weak but alive, lowered his pistol, his body trembling with relief. He looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." Elizabeth rushed into his arms, holding him tight, tears of joy streaming down her face. The nightmare was over. Justice had prevailed, and their love, tested by fire and betrayal, had emerged stronger than ever. The immediate danger had passed, but the long road to recovery, both physical and emotional, still lay ahead. Chapter 16. Echoes of the Somme. With Finch's arrest and the immediate threat neutralized, a wave of exhaustion washed over Elizabeth and Nathaniel. The adrenaline that had fueled their desperate flight subsided, leaving them drained and shaken. Private Baker, thanks to Elizabeth's quick thinking and medical care, was stabilized and transported to a nearby military hospital, his chances of recovery significantly improved. General Howard, deeply apologetic for the ordeal Nathaniel had endured, arranged for them to be taken to a British military base near Reims. There, Nathaniel received proper medical attention for his injuries, while Elizabeth was given a chance to rest and recover from the harrowing experience. The days that followed were a blur of medical examinations, debriefings, and official inquiries. Nathaniel, with Elizabeth by his side, recounted his story in detail, providing General Howard and his staff with a comprehensive account of Finch's treachery, his espionage activities, and his desperate attempts to cover his tracks. The evidence Nathaniel had gathered, combined with the testimony of Genevieve who had been brought to Reims under General Howard's protection, and the information gleaned from Finch's captured men, was irrefutable. Finch was swiftly court-martialed and sentenced to life imprisonment, his career and reputation in ruins. As Nathaniel recovered, he and Elizabeth spent hours talking, sharing their experiences, their fears, and their hopes for the future. They revisited the painful memories of their separation, the lies and deceptions that had nearly torn them apart, and the enduring love that had sustained them through it all. One afternoon, while walking through the grounds of the military base, they came across a small, makeshift memorial, a simple wooden cross erected in memory of the soldiers who had fallen in the battles of the Somme. The sight of the cross, a stark reminder of the horrors of war, brought back a flood of memories for both of them. "It's hard to believe it's over," Elizabeth said, her voice soft. "So much loss, so much suffering," Nathaniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the cross. "The war may be over, but the echoes, they'll always be with us." He spoke of his time in the trenches, the constant fear, the relentless shelling, the loss of comrades. He spoke of his capture, his imprisonment, his escape, and his desperate struggle to survive and clear his name. Elizabeth, in turn, shared her experiences as a nurse, the endless stream of wounded soldiers, the struggle to save lives amidst the chaos and carnage, the constant presence of death and despair. They found solace in each other's presence, a shared understanding of the trauma they had both endured. The echoes of the Somme, though painful, served to strengthen their bond, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love. As they stood there, before the simple wooden cross, they made a silent vow to honor the memory of those who had fallen, to live their lives to the fullest, and to never take their love for granted. The past could not be changed, but the future was theirs to shape, a future free from the shadows of war and betrayal. The healing had begun, a slow and gradual process, but one fueled by hope and a renewed commitment to each other. Chapter 17. The Hidden Cipher. With Finch's trial and imprisonment behind them, Nathaniel and Elizabeth began the long process of rebuilding their lives. Nathaniel, though cleared of all charges and reinstated to his rank, decided to resign from the military. The war, and the betrayal he had suffered, had left him disillusioned with the world of espionage and intrigue. He longed for a simpler life, a life of peace and quiet, far from the battlefields and the shadows. Elizabeth, too, was ready for a change. She had no desire to return to England, to the stifling expectations of her family and the constant reminders of her past. She wanted to stay with Nathaniel, to build a new life with him, wherever that might lead. Before they could embark on their new life, however, there was one final piece of unfinished business: Isabel. Nathaniel was determined to find out what had happened to his former colleague, to bring closure to that chapter of his life. Genevieve, who had remained in Reims, provided them with a crucial clue. She revealed that Isabel had kept a secret diary, a detailed record of her espionage activities, including her work with Nathaniel. The diary was hidden, Genevieve explained, somewhere in Isabel's apartment in Paris, the same apartment Elizabeth and Genevieve had visited earlier. Isabel was always meticulous, Genevieve said. She kept detailed records of everything. The diary might contain information about her capture, about Finch's involvement, even about her final days. Nathaniel and Elizabeth decided to return to Paris, to search for the diary. They knew it was a long shot, but it was a chance they had to take. They arrived in Paris under assumed names, taking precautions to avoid any remaining surveillance from Finch's loyalists. They revisited Isabel's apartment, which had been sealed off by the authorities after her disappearance. With Genevieve's help, they managed to gain access to the apartment, posing as relatives seeking to retrieve personal belongings. The apartment was exactly as Elizabeth remembered it: small, tidy, with the portrait of the scarred Nathaniel still prominently displayed. They began to search, carefully examining every drawer, every cupboard, every book, every piece of furniture. They found nothing. Hours passed, and their hope began to dwindle. They were about to give up when Elizabeth noticed something peculiar about the portrait of Nathaniel. The frame was unusually thick, deeper than it needed to be. She carefully removed the portrait from the wall, examining the back of the frame. She found a small, almost invisible seam, running along the edge of the frame. With a knife, she carefully pried open the seam, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment, they found a small, leather-bound book. It was Isabel's diary. They began to read the diary, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The diary entries were written in a combination of French and a complex cipher, a code that Isabel and Nathaniel had used to communicate during their missions. Nathaniel, with his knowledge of the cipher, began to decipher the entries. The diary revealed a detailed account of Isabel's work, her growing suspicions about Finch, and her fears for her own safety. The final entry, written just hours before her capture, was chilling. Isabel wrote that she had uncovered irrefutable proof of Finch's treachery, evidence that she planned to deliver to General Howard. She also wrote that she suspected she was being followed, that she feared for her life. And then, the diary ended abruptly. But there was one more thing. Tucked inside the back cover of the diary, they found a small, folded piece of paper. It was a coded message, a final message from Isabel to Nathaniel. Nathaniel deciphered the message. It read, "The truth lies beneath the silver moon. Reims Cathedral.
Crypt.
Look for the falcon." The hidden cipher, the final message from Isabel, provided a clear directive, a path to uncovering the ultimate truth about her fate and Finch's betrayal. The echoes of the psalm and the secrets hidden within its heart were about to be revealed. The journey was not yet over. It was leading them back to Reims, to the very place where their ordeal had begun. Chapter 18. A Love Forged in Fire. The message from Isabel: "The truth lies beneath the silver moon. Reims Cathedral.
Crypt. Look for the falcon."
Sent a renewed sense of urgency through Nathaniel and Elizabeth. They returned to Reims immediately, their minds racing with possibilities. What truth lay hidden in the cathedral crypt? What connection did it have to Isabel, to Finch, to the silver moon? They arrived in Reims under the cover of darkness, the city still bearing the scars of war, its cathedral a majestic silhouette against the night sky. They knew they couldn't simply walk into the cathedral and start searching the crypt. They needed a plan, a way to gain access without attracting attention. Nathaniel contacted General Howard, who, though initially skeptical, agreed to help. He provided them with forged documents, identifying them as historians researching the cathedral's architecture. He also arranged for them to have discreet access to the crypt after closing hours. Under the cloak of their assumed identities, Nathaniel and Elizabeth entered the cathedral, the vast, echoing space filled with an aura of ancient mystery and reverence. The moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the stone floor, illuminating the intricate carvings and statues that adorned the walls. They descended into the crypt, a labyrinthine network of underground chambers and passageways, the air cold and damp, the silence broken only by their footsteps. The crypt was the resting place of centuries of bishops, archbishops, and other dignitaries, their tombs and sarcophagi lining the walls, their names and titles etched in stone. Following Isabel's instructions, they began to search for the falcon, a symbol that had become synonymous with Nathaniel's espionage identity. They examined every tomb, every inscription, every carving, searching for any sign of the familiar bird of prey. Hours passed, and their hope began to wane. They had found nothing. They were about to give up when Elizabeth noticed something peculiar about one of the tombs, a large, ornate sarcophagus belonging to a 17th-century archbishop. On the side of the sarcophagus, almost hidden among the intricate carvings, was a small, almost imperceptible image of a crescent moon. And beneath the moon, barely visible, was a tiny, stylized depiction of a falcon in flight. "Nathaniel, look," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. Nathaniel examined the carving, his eyes widening in recognition. It's the symbol," he said. "Isabel's symbol. And the falcon." He carefully examined the sarcophagus, searching for a way to open it. He found a small, hidden lever, concealed within the carving of the moon. He pressed the lever, and a section of the sarcophagus slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment, they found a small, metal box. It was locked, but Nathaniel, with his experience in espionage, quickly managed to pick the lock. Inside the box, they found a collection of documents, letters, reports, maps, and photographs. It was the evidence Isabel had gathered against Finch, the proof of his treason, his conspiracy, and his involvement in her capture, and they now suspected her murder. But there was something else in the box, something that made Elizabeth's heart ache with a mixture of sadness and joy. It was a small, silver locket containing a miniature portrait of Nathaniel, the same portrait that had been displayed in Isabel's apartment, the one showing his scars. On the back of the locket was an inscription, written in French, "To my dearest falcon, with all my love, forever. Isabel." It was clear. Isabel and Nathaniel had been more than just colleagues, they had been lovers, their bond forged in the crucible of war and espionage. Elizabeth felt a pang of jealousy, a flicker of the pain she'd felt when she'd first learned about Nathaniel's fiancé. But it was quickly replaced by a sense of understanding, a recognition of the complex and often tragic circumstances of war. "She loved you, Nathaniel," Elizabeth said softly, her voice filled with compassion. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "And I cared for her deeply. But it was different. With you, Elizabeth, it was always different." He took her hand, his gaze locking with hers. "Isabel was a part of my past, a part of the war. You are my future. You are my love." The discovery in the crypt, the truth revealed beneath the silver moon, had brought closure to the mystery of Isabel's fate and had solidified the bond between Nathaniel and Elizabeth. Their love, forged in the fire of war, betrayal, and loss, had emerged stronger, deeper, and more resilient than ever. Chapter 19. The Final Farewell. The evidence found in the Reims Cathedral crypt, meticulously gathered and hidden by Isabel, provided the final, irrefutable proof of Sir Alistair Finch's guilt, not only for treason and conspiracy, but also for Isabel's murder. The documents revealed that Finch had ordered Isabel's capture and execution, fearing that she would expose his crimes. Her body, they learned, had been secretly disposed of, leaving no trace. With Finch's crimes fully exposed and his life sentence secured, Nathaniel and Elizabeth felt a sense of closure, a release from the burden of the past. They had avenged Isabel's death, cleared Nathaniel's name, and brought a dangerous traitor to justice. They decided to hold a small, private memorial service for Isabel, a final farewell to a woman who had sacrificed her life for her country and for the man she loved. They gathered with Genevieve, Madame Du Bois, and General Howard at a quiet spot overlooking the Somme, the same landscape that had witnessed so much suffering and loss during the war. They shared memories of Isabel, her courage, her intelligence, her unwavering dedication to her cause. Nathaniel spoke of their time together, their shared missions, their bond forged in the crucible of espionage. He acknowledged his love for her, a love born of shared danger and mutual respect, but he also reaffirmed his enduring love for Elizabeth, the woman who had stood by him through it all. As the sun set over the Somme, casting a golden glow over the fields of poppies, they released a single white dove, a symbol of peace and remembrance. It soared into the sky, disappearing into the vast expanse of the horizon, carrying with it their prayers and their final farewell to Isabel. With the past finally laid to rest, Nathaniel and Elizabeth turned their attention to the future. They decided to leave France, to start a new life together, far from the memories of war and betrayal. They chose to settle in a small, peaceful village in the English countryside, a place where they could find solace, healing, and a sense of belonging. Nathaniel purchased a small cottage, surrounded by a garden filled with flowers and fruit trees. He took up carpentry, crafting furniture and other objects from wood, finding a sense of peace and purpose in working with his hands. Elizabeth, drawing on her nursing experience, volunteered at the local village clinic, helping those in need and finding fulfillment in serving her community. They spent their days together, working in the garden, reading books, taking long walks in the countryside, and simply enjoying each other's company. They had found a quiet, simple life, a life far removed from the chaos and danger of their past. But the memories of the war, the echoes of the Somme, never completely faded. They remained a part of them, a reminder of the sacrifices they had made, the challenges they had overcome, and the enduring power of love. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Nathaniel took Elizabeth's hand, his gaze locking with hers. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "After everything, after the war, after Isabel, I thought I was lost. But you brought me back. You gave me hope. You gave me love." Elizabeth smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "And you, Nathaniel, you gave me strength. You showed me that even in the darkest of times, love can endure. Love can heal." They embraced, their hearts filled with gratitude and a deep, abiding love. The final farewell had been said, not just to Isabel, but to the shadows of their past. They were ready to embrace the future, a future filled with hope, peace, and the promise of a love that had been forged in fire and tested by time. Chapter 20. The Dawn of Remembrance. Years passed, and the scars of war, both physical and emotional, began to fade. Nathaniel and Elizabeth settled into a comfortable routine, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the village and the changing seasons. Their cottage became a haven, a place of warmth, laughter, and quiet companionship. They had found a measure of peace, a contentment that had eluded them for so long. The villagers, initially curious about the newcomers, gradually accepted them, drawn to their kindness, their generosity, and their quiet strength. Nathaniel's carpentry skills were in high demand, and Elizabeth's nursing experience proved invaluable to the community. They became an integral part of the village life, their presence a source of comfort and support. One spring morning, as they were working in their garden, they received a letter from Genevieve. She wrote that she was getting married to a fellow resistance fighter she had met during the war. She invited them to the wedding, which was to be held in Paris. Nathaniel and Elizabeth hesitated. Returning to Paris, to the scene of so much pain and turmoil, was a daunting prospect. But they also knew that they couldn't refuse Genevieve's invitation. She had been a loyal friend, a trusted ally, and a crucial part of their journey. They decided to go, to face their past one last time, and to celebrate a new beginning with their friend. The journey to Paris was filled with mixed emotions. As they approached the city, Memories flooded back. The crowded train station, the smoky cafe, the secret meetings, the constant fear of discovery. But there were also moments of joy, of reconnection, of renewed hope. They met with Genevieve, who was radiant with happiness. She introduced them to her fiancé, a kind and gentle man who clearly adored her. They attended the wedding, a small, intimate ceremony held in a beautiful old church, a symbol of hope and renewal. After the wedding, Nathaniel and Elizabeth decided to visit a few familiar places, locations that held special significance for them. They went to the old church where they had first met the spy, Monsieur Dubois. They walked along the Seine, remembering their stolen moments together. And they visited Le Chat Noir, the cafe where they had first encountered Genevieve. The cafe was much the same as they remembered it, still dimly lit, still filled with the scent of tobacco smoke and strong coffee. But the atmosphere was different. The war was over, and the air of secrecy and intrigue had dissipated. As they sat at a table, sipping their coffee, they noticed a familiar figure sitting alone in a corner. It was Madame Dubois, older now, but still recognizable, her eyes still sharp and intelligent. They approached her, and she greeted them with a warm smile. They spent hours talking, reminiscing about the past, sharing stories, and catching up on each other's lives. Madame Dubois revealed that she had known all along about Monsieur Dubois, her nephew, and his involvement in the intelligence network. She had played a crucial role in protecting them, in guiding them, and in ensuring their eventual success. "I knew you could do it," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I knew you were strong, resilient, and deeply in love. That's what matters most, you know.
Love.
It can conquer anything, even war." As they left the cafe, Nathaniel and Elizabeth felt a sense of peace, a feeling that they had finally come full circle. They had faced their past, honored their memories, and reaffirmed their love for each other. They returned to their quiet village, to their cottage, to their garden, to their simple, peaceful life. The dawn of remembrance had arrived, not as a sudden burst of light, but as a gradual, gentle illumination, a recognition that the past, though always present, no longer held them captive. They were free, free to love, free to live, free to embrace the future, together. They knew that challenges would come, that life would always have its share of sorrows and difficulties, but that they had the love and each other to weather any future storms. Epilogue. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields of Kent. Elizabeth sat on the porch swing of their cottage, a worn copy of Persuasion resting on her lap, though her eyes were not on the pages. Nathaniel was in his workshop, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer a familiar and comforting sound. It had been many years since their return to England, many years since the tumultuous events of the war and its aftermath had reshaped their lives. The village had become their home, its inhabitants their extended family. The scars, both visible and unseen, had faded, though they would never completely disappear. They were reminders of a past survived, a love tested, and a future forged together. Elizabeth looked out at the garden, a riot of color and fragrance. Roses, lavender, honeysuckle, the scents mingled in the evening air, a sweet symphony of remembrance. She remembered the small garden in Amiens, the stolen kisses, the whispered promises. She remembered the bleak, desolate landscape of the Somme, the fear, the desperation, the constant threat of death. She remembered Isabel, the brave, intelligent woman who had loved Nathaniel, who had sacrificed her life for a cause she believed in. Elizabeth felt no jealousy, only a profound sense of respect and gratitude. Isabel was a part of their story, a part of the tapestry of their lives. Nathaniel emerged from his workshop, wiping his hands on a piece of cloth. He smiled at Elizabeth, his eyes, though aged, still held that same spark of intensity, that same depth of love that had captured her heart so many years ago. He sat beside her on the swing, taking her hand in his. They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's presence, the quiet companionship that had become the cornerstone of their lives. "I was thinking," Nathaniel said, his voice low and gentle, "about that day in Paris."
At Gare du Nord.
Elizabeth smiled. The ghost at Gare du Nord. I saw you, Nathaniel said. Before you saw me, I almost didn't turn around. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of facing you. Afraid of the past. Afraid of everything. But you did turn around, Elizabeth said. And that changed everything. Nathaniel nodded. It did. It brought me back to life. It brought me back to you. He leaned over and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss that encompassed their entire journey, their love, their loss, their resilience, their hope. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elizabeth rested her head on Nathaniel's shoulder, a sense of profound peace settling over her. The echoes of the war still lingered, but they were faint now, distant murmurs in the symphony of their lives. The dawn of remembrance had fully arrived, illuminating a future built on a love that had endured the ravages of war, the sting of betrayal, and the passage of time. It was a love that had been forged in fire, tested in adversity, and ultimately triumphant. It was a love that would last a lifetime, a love that was, in its own quiet way, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The final farewells were made. Their life and love story could continue, a simple, ordinary, miraculous thing.